Welcome back to the DF Pastors Podcast. I'm Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum and host for today's conversation. We're hopeful that in the midst of this summer that your ministry is going strong wherever God has led you to serve, and that this podcast will be helpful and encouraging to helping you to be a part of what God is doing in and through the midst of your ministry and in your community in every good way. Today, we're going to talk about a very challenging but important topic, which is churches and pastors being involved in the criminal justice system, particularly within the context of the prison system. Let me give you a little story to give you a context. Almost 40 years ago, I was a high school senior, and I had been a Christian for a little bit more than a year, and was asked to be a part of a youth musical that we then performed not only for our church, but ultimately took into 6 different prisons within the Texas prison system. That was the first time I'd ever been in any kind of a jail or prison. I learned the difference between the two, by the way, over the years. But it was also in that experience that God began to bring me into a calling of ministry. And so that unique experience really sets something of a foundation for me for the conversation that we're going to have today. And it's my privilege to introduce to you Joe Ingle. Joe is a death row pastor, and we're going to get him to unpack just that description in and of itself. But he is also the founder of the Southern Center for Human Rights. He was born in North Carolina, but left after he graduated high school and after he attended college. He found himself in East Harlem and was a student at Union Theological Seminary, and has recently authored his memoir that is called Too Close to the Flame, with the condemned inside the Southern killing machine. He'll explain that for us as well. But Joe has spent the last 45 years being involved in caring for people in the midst of extreme brokenness, caring particularly for those that are on death row in various prisons around the United States. And we're going to ask him to just tell us about that experience and to help us to learn as pastors, how can we get involved in prison ministry, even into death row ministry? And if we're already involved, how could we get more involved and be even more effective? And so, Joe, welcome to the Denison Forum Pastors Podcast. We're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background growing up in North Carolina. You, I know, are a man of faith and a Christ follower. Tell us a little bit about your spiritual journey and how you ended up pursuing a ministry calling by going to Union and finding yourself in Harlem.
Well, as you mentioned, I was a native of North Carolina. My parents were educators. We moved around little towns in North Carolina where they taught. And then my father became a principal in Jonesville when I was 7 years old. Jonesville's north of Winston-Salem. And after 18 months there, he up and died at age 42.
Oh, wow.
And so that really scrambled our family. I was 7. My sister Kay was 3.5. My mom was 36. So she finished teaching English that second semester of high school. We moved back to East Carolina in Greenville. I was born in Greenville and lived with her parents. They had a rental home there that they lived in and let us, the 3 of us, live in one room. Nobody had any money. Mom worked on her master's degree. I was in the 3rd grade. Then after a year of that, we moved on to Asheville, and I recovered my happiness in the mountains of North Carolina. And then on to high school in Raleigh, where my mom had a job working for the state of North Carolina, college at St. Andrews in Laurinburg, St. Andrews Presbyterian. So I was raised a Presbyterian through this whole growing up experience. And although I later became a United Church of Christ minister, my mother's mother, my mama, I loved her so much. She said, "You know, Joe, I'm really pleased that you were ordained. I'm just sorry it couldn't have been in the Presbyterian church." So I said, "Mama, just the way it worked out." And it worked out that way because I was against the Vietnam War and I was for civil rights. And in the Southern Presbyterian Church, that was not a very popular position in '69. Right. So I took myself north to East Harlem, where there was a wonderful program called the East Harlem Urban Year. You lived in East Harlem, which was really a ghetto, 45% African American, 45% Puerto Rican, 10% everything else. So obviously I was in the 10%.
Wow.
And great educational experience for me. First year I was a youth advisor at Church of the Good Neighbor on 106th Street. Now, Mark, I'm a North Carolinian. I thought I had a pretty good jump shot. But I was playing with these kids in my youth group, and oh man, was it embarrassing. I mean, these kids were really, really good. So I had quite the year with them and really enjoyed it. But I was coming up on my senior year of seminary. I wanted something different. I wasn't really necessarily going to be a minister. I was interested in religion, studying the Bible and philosophy, religion and philosophy in my undergraduate work.
Right.
And the fall of 71, I'm sitting there in my tenement apartment looking at my little black and white TV, and this event happens called Attica in an upstate New York prison, which was a revolt by the prisoners. They took it over in September of 71, and I'm watching this on my black and white TV thinking, one, I know nothing about prisons. I hadn't even been in one. You were in one in high school. I had never been in a prison. Two, if these guys are even 10% correct about the way they've been treated, I would have been upset too.
Sure.
And three, my neighbors are dealing with the police and the DAs and the whole system every day. I need to check this out. So the East Harlem urban years, you spend 20 hours a week working in the community. So I spent my 20 hours, my senior year of seminary, working at the Bronx House of Detention, which is just across the river up in the borough of Bronx from East Harlem. And it all changed for me when I went up for my first visit. Now, I had an orientation by the chaplain. I had my little badge. I go up to the 6th floor, get off the elevator, walk up to the door. The guard sees my badge. He opens the door, lets me in. And, you see this stuff on TV. But once he opened that door and I looked in there, I thought, whoa, what I'm looking at is this huge cage.
Right.
And that was the cell block. And he walked me over down the top of that cage. We got to a corner and he said, this is where pastors and lawyers meet in this little room he gestured to. Hey, I'm a naive seminarian, right? So I just looked at that guy and said, let me in here with these guys. He looked at me and shrugged his shoulders. He clearly never had that before. Opened up the door. And so I stepped across the threshold into the cell block. Now, I hadn't really checked the cell block out. I just assumed I was walking in and I'd be visiting through these guys through their individual locked doors.
Right.
But once I crossed that threshold and he slammed that door behind me, and I could still feel that. I mean, he really enjoyed that.
And yeah, I know what you mean. Yep.
I saw those individual doors were open. So there was nothing between me and the prisoners. And my first thought was this: oh my God, he's locked me in here with these animals. And that was my first revelation about what we're all taught in our society, that somehow we regard people in jail or prison, perhaps not as animals, but less than who we are because they are there.
Right.
In other words, we're better. And so I had that thought, and this guy in the first bunk looked up at me and said, man, what are you doing in here? I laughed. I said, well, I'm here to visit you guys for a year. And he said, sit down. So I sat down. He introduced himself. Then he took me down, introduced me to everyone else in that pod. And I spent that year visiting the men in that cell block. And that was the beginning of my education in prisons because I knew nothing before I went into that experience.
Wow. So God just really started getting a hold of you right there. And I can relate to some of that experience. First time you go into any kind of a detention center like that, and those doors, they don't just slam, they lock, especially these days electronically. And I can remember going into the holding cage where they put you into basically a holding cell, lock the door behind you, and then open the next one so you can move forward. And it's a very disturbing and profound experience that stays with you. And then you find yourself really in another world. It just feels like in some ways you're on another planet. How does that move forward from from that point, what becomes the next couple of steps toward engaging in ministry within the prison system, and particularly your story starts to really start to get narrow and focused on those that are on death row. How does that part start to get traction in your life?
Well, so I'm having this experience of visiting these guys, and sends me back to read the Bible.
Hmm.
You know, they don't teach you Sunday school and in church what the Bible has to say about prisoners in prisons. So
Right.
I had to go back and read that myself. And one of the key things I learned was this. That first experience I had of feeling superior to those men because I was not locked up is totally rebuked in the Bible.
Hmm.
Jesus himself in the 8th chapter of John, where he confronts the woman who is guilty of a capital crime. She should be executed. And the Jewish leaders bring her to him and basically want him to say, yeah, let's do it. And he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Well, you got to give those good Jews the credit. They realized none of them were without sin. So
Starting with the oldest ones, yeah.
He looked at her and said, woman, has no one condemned you? She said, no, Lord, not one. He said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. That is Jesus' radical message about the death penalty. It's also a radical message about judgment. And that's what I learned. Judgment. Who are we to judge that someone is not worthy of life? Who are we to judge to lock someone up for the rest of their life? I mean, these are huge, huge decisions that you make.
Right.
And when you look at the Bible and read Jesus and you read the prophets and you studying what is actually going on here, God has a whole different agenda than what we have. And his agenda is about reaching out to the poor and dispossessed and trying to let them feel the love of God and the reconciliation of God with them through love and through Jesus. That's the whole thing. And I learned that the way you communicate that is by showing up. You don't go in with a Bible and thump people over the head with it. You just show up and you're there for them on whatever terms they want me to be there. I am there for them. Then we get into discussions about things, and over time they'll say, so why are you coming in here? And I can tell them, I'm coming in here because I understand that's what Jesus wants me to do. Now, that method of indirection, and the theologian Soren Kierkegaard, the great Danish theologian, call that the method of indirection. That, to me, has proved the most effective way of communicating with prisoners because they're turned off by the church. They've had disastrous experience with the institutional church. So the last thing I want to do is go in there as a, quote, church representative and meet their expectations. No, I want them to see me as someone who's listening to them, hearing what they have to say, trying to understand their problems, and if there's any way I can help them, help them. Then later on, we can have a discussion about, okay, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus if that's what's bringing you in here?
So it sounds like just in listening to you talk about that, it starts with the standpoint of, I'm here to care about you as one human being to another, irregardless of where this may go in terms of conversation or where it may go in terms of your guilt or innocence, wherever it may go in terms of your faith perspective, whether you move toward faith or you move further away from faith, I'm still going to show up and I'm going to care about you in an unconditional kind of way. And it also sounds like one of the things that you're bringing out that ought to be an important reminder to us is, if you're going to get involved with ministry, but particularly this kind of ministry, you need to make a long-term commitment. Just going once or twice in your life or every now and then to say that you have experienced an inside of a prison, or kind of like you've gone one time on an international mission trip, that's not really going to be the best approach to making the kind of difference that is needed in this area. Am I tracking with you in that?
Yeah, you are, Mark. That's a very good point. We stood up here in 1975 in Nashville, where death row is, a visitation on death row program. It's been going on since 1975. We match people from religious communities with people on death row. Totally volunteer program. The prisoners say, yeah, I'd like a visitor. The people in the religious community say, I'd like to visit. We do an orientation at the prison so they know all the rules and regs. They know what to expect. And they're off on a one-on-one visitation situation. Now, I've had people doing this for over 30 years. I mean, it's amazing. There's incredible friendships here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key. You keep showing up. And when people are in this kind of situation in prison, they're counting on you.
Mm.
You know, you do not tell someone on death row something you're going to do unless you can do it,
Mm.
period. Because they have no other communication with the outside world. You're their
Right.
contact. So
Right.
they're counting on you, and a real trust is built up. And so we've been very fortunate to have this program since 1975, ongoing through numerous executions, and that's the key. It's building relationships.
And that's something I wanted to talk with you about, obviously, Joe, that people get to know your ministry, they get to read your book, that type of thing. They will know that you are a uh, strong and consistent voice in opposition to the death penalty. But you're serving in a state, if I understand it right, and ministering in a system where the death penalty is still carried out. Um, tell us a little bit about that. What do you do when I can imagine serving and ministering in Nashville and other places across the South that you've had an endless number of conversations with people who support the death penalty. How does that conversation usually go? I'm not talking about, people that don't want to have a calm and respectful conversation, but when you're talking with somebody that, a pastor who believes that there's a place for the death penalty in our system of justice, if you're talking to a person who's volunteering with your ministry, how does that conversation usually go between you and that person that has a different view from you?
Well, you have to understand that I'm a biblical person, foremost. I mean, the things that influence me, three things: Jesus of Nazareth, the Bible, and prisoners.
Hmm.
That's my tri-corner stool, if you will. Those are the
Right.
three legs. So we just talked about what Jesus says about the death penalty, so he's pretty clear. There are 23 scriptural references to the death penalty, Mark. Now, let's think about this. 23. Most of those overwhelmingly are in the Old Testament. Documents that were written thousands of years ago for societies totally unrelated to what we have now. I mean, do we really think God wants us to, execute kids who talk back to their parents? Execute people for adultery? No, I don't think so. I think we've evolved in our faith beyond that. And so I'm happy to have a scriptural discussion about the death penalty. But I think when you weigh all that out, the scales really tip over to Jesus, because that's who we're talking about as Christians. And he's so clear about this in the 8th chapter of John. And not only that, but read Matthew 25. Read Matthew 5. I mean, this is a man who's wandering through the Galilee, teaching and preaching a radical message of love and reconciliation. To the least of these. That's who he's talking to. He's not talking to the wealthy. That's not who he's talking to.
Right.
And that's who's responding to him. And so that's who we should be talking to. And that's the message we should be carrying. We shouldn't be going in there on someone on death row and saying, "Oh yeah, I'm for the death penalty." No, I mean, I'll share John Spinkelink, first guy I got to be very close with in Florida. He's like a brother to me. I visited Governor Graham about him in 1979 in the spring. And John told me that the chaplain at the prison had come to pray with him. Now, John was running out of his appeals. And the chaplain's name was Savage. I'm not making that up. That was his name. Chaplain Savage came to John's cell. He said, "John, would you like to pray?" John looked at him and said, "Chaplain Savage, I understand you're for the death penalty. Is that correct?" Chaplain Savage sort of looked down at his feet and nodded his head. And John said, "How can I have someone pray for me who wants to see me killed?" Oh, John hit it right on the head there. That nail was hit right on the head with that little statement. How can that happen? That can't happen.
Right.
No. So you have to understand who you're talking to and from what position you're talking from before you get into these situations.
Yeah. So give us, I was appreciative of your book in just learning the framework and some of the statistics around the U.S. Prison system, number of people on death row. Frame that out for these pastors. You do a great job in just using statistics in a way that just help us paint the picture. And I don't think many pastors, I know I didn't, really have a perspective on this is where we are as a country when it comes to incarcerated individuals, number of people on death row, that type of thing. Give us that picture.
Yeah, it's quite important to understand how unusual we are as a country. We like to compare ourselves to Europeans.
Right.
Europeans do not have the death penalty. You cannot be a member of the European Union if you have the death penalty. They think we're totally barbaric. I've been over there to speak 4 different times, and they're just blown away that we have the death penalty. Nor can they believe that we're engaged in mass incarceration. We have 2.2 million people locked up in our prison system. We have another 6 million on probation and parole. I mean, what on earth are we doing here? I mean, we need to think about this whole process, especially in a Christian context, because that leads you toward a consideration of things like reconciliation and restoration, which would be a whole alternative way of doing what I now call the criminal legal system. I don't even call it the criminal justice system anymore, because it's criminal, that's for sure. It's legal and it's a system, but there's very little justice in it. Because let's look at a few stats that you mentioned. The first execution in the U.S. was 1608. Now, from 1608, Mark, be ready. I'm going to give you a test question at the end of this.
Okay.
From 1608 through 1976, when the U.S. Supreme Court brought back the death penalty with 3 decisions, Jurek v. Texas. You're a Texas boy. There you go.
Right. Yep.
Gregg versus Georgia. Prophet v. Florida. All southern states. That's no accident. They brought the death penalty back. So here's your question, from 1608, first execution, through 76, we'd had roughly 16,500 executions in the United States of America. How many of those executions were of white people for killing black people?
I don't know. I know it's heavily tilted.
You're going to dodge on me? You're not going to take a guess?
It's like 90% of black people who have killed white people.
Here's the deal. If you were to say the answer is 31, you would have the correct answer, because there were 31 white people executed for killing a black person over that length of time. But we have to take 10 out. Think about that for a minute. We have to discount 10. Why would that be?
That's the stat I don't remember.
That's because those 10 were not regarded as human beings. They were slaves.
Oh, wow.
So they were killed by their masters. So in this whole time period, we've got all these thousands of people executed, and only 21 really are people who are white people executed for killing a black person. So you have an incredibly racist system on the basis of race of victim.
Right.
And that was reaffirmed in the case McCluskey v. Kemp in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1991. And that involved Warren McCluskey, a guy I was close to on Georgia's death row, who was at an Atlanta furniture store. A robbery happened. Policeman was killed. Warren didn't kill him. But guess what? As almost always happens in these multiple situations of offense that goes wrong and someone gets killed, somebody says, oh, this guy did it. Well, Warren didn't do it. But the guy who actually did it fingered Warren, and it's felony murder. So if you're there and someone's killed, whether you kill him or not, you're just as eligible as the person who did the killing. So Warren goes off to death row. It is ultimately electrocuted in 91 for this, for a crime he should have never been even given the death penalty for. But part of that whole thing was a study was done by Roger Baldus of every murder in Georgia. Every murder in Georgia. And he found that you were anywhere from 11 to 22 times more likely to receive the death penalty if you killed a white person. If you kill a black person, not so much, man. It's not happening. Wow. So even the modern stats show the same thing, and that's been replicated in 20 other states. So it's racist. And the other thing is poverty. As Steve Bright, who's a dear friend and a veteran lawyer on these cases and been fighting the death penalty, actually, I hired Steve to run the Southern Center for Human Rights back in 1988. He's argued in the Supreme Court many times, and he says, Joe, it's really simple. It's not those who commit the worst murder that come to death row. It's those who have the worst lawyers. He's exactly right. How do you have the worst lawyer? Because you can't pay for one. So these guys do not have decent lawyers. They're not represented by crackerjack public defenders either. We're talking about the South, people. If you know the South, we are backwards. We've always been backwards. We are still backwards. And we came up with slavery. We went on from there to the new Jim Crow. We went on from there to, segregation, one thing after another. So we still have a really invidious discriminatory system in this country in the criminal legal system. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. So you've been, like I said, so deeply involved. You've given your life to this essentially over the last 45, 50 years. What would you tell us has changed over the last 50 years particularly? And along with that, Joe, what gives you hope? What gives you signs of encouragement as about where we are now in this whole journey that you recount so well in your book, and then just in what you're telling us right now? What's changed in your perspective, and what gives you hope?
Well, the book is entitled "Too Close to the Flame," which is talking about me. I became too close to the flame, and I became burned. And then the subtitle is "With the Condemned Inside the Southern Killing Machine." So that is a grim assessment of where we're at and how we got here in those 45 years. Now, you're asking for hope. Well, fortunately, last time I checked, Jesus is still on the main line as far as I'm concerned. I can call him up and tell him what I want, to quote the old blues song. So that's what I do. So there's that. And there's also, unlike when I was talking to Governor Graham in the spring of 79, the death penalty support has really changed. There is now a majority of people in this country against the death penalty. That was not the case.
What do you think has brought that pivot into being?
Well, there's been a lot of education on this issue. I think people have learned a lot. The crime rate's down. People now realize the death penalty has nothing to do with the crime rate. The crime rate's been down for quite a while. We had a little bleep in the pandemic, but basically the crime rate's not a real problem in this country. So there's that. And also the innocence. We have had so many people exonerated and moved off of death row. Here in Tennessee, we've had several cases of this. And people have realized, well, gee, what are innocent people doing on death row? Well, then they look into it and realize that the factors we just described, race and class, have everything to do with who goes to death row, not whether you commit a crime or not.
Have you had the experience of ministering, particularly to folks on death row? Have you ever had the experience where you yourself were concerned, or that someone scared you? Or tell us, so many great stories in your book about these individuals that you've known over time. You've had the opportunity to develop relationship with them. Some of them you've literally walked them to their last breath and have been in those experiences with them. It just, something just makes me want to ask you, have you ever been scared?
The only time, so I told you about the Bronx House of Detention. I was obviously scared that first time I walked into the Bronx House of D. But once I started entering prisoners in the South, which I started in 74, only time I was ever scared was when I was called by the warden to come out to the Tennessee State Prison in 1975 because September of 75, the prisoners had erupted. And I talked to the warden, and this was September. I talked to the warden all spring and summer. This place is really about to explode. You need to back off on some of these rules. They seem to be arbitrary to the men. He wasn't listening, and then boom, it blew up. So he called me out there to negotiate. The prisoners had control of the prison. I walked back out into the yard. Prisoners everywhere, mealing, running around, acting the fool. And the only time I was scared in all my years of work is I knew there was a guard up in that tower who had a gun. I'll tell you what I knew about that tower, too, because I was out there earlier in the week. And Captain Martin was in the control unit there just before you walk out in the yard. And I was walking by the control unit to go out in the yard. He said, "Joe, come in here." So I came in and sat down with Captain Martin. He said, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm fine." He said, "So, I've been having a kind of a tough day." And then all of a sudden the phone rang. Captain Martin picked it up. He says, "No, no, no." It hung up. Captain Martin looked at me and said, "You know what that was, Joe?" I said, "No, Captain Martin, I don't." He said, "That was the guard up in that tower. He wanted to know if he could shoot that prisoner for walking across the yard without the proper pass."
Oh, wow.
So I'm out there thinking, there's a guard up in that tower. He's got a gun, and I'm out here with these prisoners. Yeah, it could very well happen. I could be taking a hit here, because these guys are not thinking too clearly up there.
Right.
But that was the only time I've ever been really scared in a prison.
Yeah. So this conversation is obviously directed at pastors and the churches that they lead. Give us some sense of how a pastor might get started. You came in the 70s, set up this visitation program there in Nashville. I'm assuming that's because you saw the need, that there were a good number of people, particularly people on death row, that nobody was coming to visit.
Correct.
And is the fulfillment of, you read again, Matthew 24, Jesus doesn't say, "Go visit only those people you know are innocent." He says, "Go visit the people that are in jail."
Correct.
Talk about that as just the identification of a simple need, and then a simple idea of, hey, can we get people to just come and have conversation, one-on-one human conversation with somebody that is inside of this prison, and they are aware that they're not likely to get out and have a life beyond this prison. How would you encourage a pastor, a church, to say, look around your community, look at what the prison system, the jail system is within your community, and start looking for ways to get involved? How would you encourage them to do that?
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Mark, because that's really what needs to happen. We have so many jails and prisons in this country, it's ridiculous. So there's not a lack of opportunity here. And unfortunately, many of the people locked up in these places don't have people visiting them. So there's a real need. So what you can do, and let me just mention this book that was written by a woman who came through our visitation program, because it gives a real firsthand view of what it is like to be involved in visiting someone as a member of a family over a number of years. And her name is Suzanne Craig Robertson. The name of the book is He Called Me Sister. So Cecil Johnson called her sister because she visited, and her family visited him while he was on death row. So He Called Me Sister is a great book about how, and interestingly enough, Suzanne didn't want to visit to begin with. I made the presentation at her church. Her husband was interested, and he started visiting with their 3-year-old, and she's realizing, well, here I am. My husband and 3-year-old are out there visiting this guy on death row, and I'm not. What's wrong with me? Maybe I need to check it out. So it's a wonderful story. She tells a great story, and that takes you in there so you see how you might do this. You can go and talk to the sheriff if it's a jail, whoever's running the prison, it's a warden, perhaps a chaplain, talk to whoever's there. express your interest and see if there's a way you and your church can get involved. Because after all, that's what Jesus says to do. I mean, we're not making this stuff up. So
Right.
don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry about doing right. Just get yourself in there. Show up. That's the whole key. And it'll sort of take on its own life once you show up.
Yeah, what a good word. What a good word. Want to give one last question before we're done, and that is your book shines such a light over how this struggle has been so broken with so many broken people, so many hard stories. This is, in some ways, your book is not an easy book to read on some pages, obviously, because it is dealing with, in many ways, human beings at their worst in a lot of different ways. But you use the term restorative justice. Uh, give us your sense of what you mean by that, and some of the pillars that are really the anchor points of what restorative justice would look like on a better scale in our country.
So Howard Zehr, Zehr, has written the Bible of restorative justice. It's called Changing Lenses. Everybody should read Howard's book. And I won't get off into all that. He makes it very clear, very compelling. But I will give an example of a family I work with. Now, restorative justice is usually not used in murder cases because the key to restorative justice is you have a victim and offender, and you have a facilitator who meets with each one in advance, talks to them, makes sure they want to do this process, then brings them together. Again, it's a totally voluntary process. And the victim gets to talk about her needs. What happened? Why did it happen? Is it going to happen again, etc.? And the offender has a chance to respond. And in the process of this dialogue and understanding occurs, and usually what happens 9 out of 10 times is an agreement is reached where they can engage in restoration, where the offender can, either through apology or whatever way he comes up with, make a restoration to the victim. Sometimes that's monetary. It just depends on what the circumstances are.
Right.
And that can be a way of doing this, as opposed to retribution, which is the current system we have, where you've got the defense and the prosecution hammering each other under the theory that truth's going to come out, and there's no concern for the victim here. Their needs aren't being met. So restorative justice is victim driven, and hopefully it will meet those needs. Now, Hector and Susie Black, I'll take just a minute because I work with them. Their daughter, Tricia, adult, was murdered in Atlanta. And we met at a murder victims family for reconciliation conference. And we were talking, they were also from Tennessee, interestingly enough. We had to go to Boston to meet each other, even though we're both from Tennessee.
Wow.
And they told me that Tricia had been murdered and they were heartbroken. And this had just happened 6 months previously. And the DA wanted the death penalty and they didn't know what to do. And so we talked, and I agreed I'd come back to their house and visit with them and their children, their other adult children. And I did that. And we went through that whole process of who Tricia was, what she meant to them, how much they loved her, how heartbroken they were. And then we come to, what do you want to do? They did not want the death penalty after going through that process because of their own Christian belief. They didn't believe Jesus would want them to have that person killed for killing Tricia. They just didn't believe it. So we worked out a restorative justice, semi-restorative justice situation that was taken to the judge, and that was based on a letter that Hector wrote with the family. Actually wrote with me. I helped him hammer it out. And it stated clearly, we don't want a trial. We don't want the death penalty. We just don't want to go down there even, because you're going to pull the scab off of this wound. All the press will be there. And so the judge brought the defense lawyer and the prosecutor, who was gung-ho for the death penalty, and said, look, have you all read this letter? Yes, Your Honor, we've read it. He said, well, look, this is what we're going to do. And all of a sudden, the DA goes off on how the state of Georgia needs the maximum punishment. The judge finally said, look, Mr. Howard, have you really read this letter? This is the victim's family. They're going to get on the stand and say this. there's not going to be a death penalty once the victim's family gets on the stand. He said, well, I see what you're saying, Your Honor. So he backed off. So they decided they would hold a hearing. And at that hearing, the victim's family, assuming Susan Wardell's client was willing to take a life sentence, which he was, the victim's family get up and talk as they talked in that letter. And that's what happened. Hector got up there, looked at Ivan Simpkins in the face, told him how much he had broken their hearts, how much they loved Tricia, and just talked about what Tricia had done, and they had done with Tricia over the years. And then he says, you know, Ivan, we do not hate you. We hate what you did. And he started crying. Ivan Simpkins started crying. He said, our challenge is to love you as Christians and hopefully to forgive you. That's our challenge as Christians, because Tricia would want that, and we want that, and we do not hate you. And, you know, there's utter quiet in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Judge pronounces the sentence, and Simpkins says, I'd like to say something. He gets up and he apologizes. So why did Ivan Simpkins do this? Ivan Simpkins, as a child, watched his mother drown his brother. Ivan Simpkins was also almost drowned by the same woman. He was profoundly psychotic. He was off his meds when this happened, and that's why this terrible thing happened. So there's a story behind each one of these, Mark. If you take the time to find the story, you'll understand the situation and understand why Jesus could say, love your enemy. That's why he could say it, because there's a story there if you take the time to find it.
Yeah. And that kind of truth is really at the base of so many, if not all, of the stories that you talk about, and really the call of the book, which when I was reading through parts of the book, Joe, just this idea of fundamental to being a person of faith, of Christian faith, is that people can change.
Correct.
And if we lose sight and lose hold of that promise and of that hope that people can change, then we've really given up on the essence of the gospel and the Christian message. That's what grace and that's what mercy are all about, and that God is working that in our lives. I want to thank you for the conversation today, Joe, and thank our listeners as well. We'll put all of these in the show notes, the books that you referenced as other recommended reading. But Joe's book, again, is called Too Close to the Flame, With the Condemned Inside the Southern Killing Machine. A lot of thought-provoking conversation that every minister, every pastor, every church needs to consider as they look for ways to be redemptive in the work that God is seeking to do in every community and every part of the United States. Joe, blessings on you. Thank you for being a part of the Denison Forum Pastors Podcast. I want to thank our audience again. And if this has been helpful to you, please rate, review this, share this with your fellow pastors, and do some research in this area and do some research in your community where you can help in this very vital area of ministering to those who are living their lives beyond and behind the walls. Talk to you soon next time on the Denison Forum Pastors Podcast.
Thank you, Mark.